Hello, my dear friends. Welcome back to another evening of stories and distant memories. Tonight, we will sit together and listen to the whispers rising from the sands of Egypt, where the gods not only dwelt in temples, but also lived within the way humans imagined the birth of the world. Let your breath slow down, release the weight from your shoulders, and join me in opening the door to a time when darkness and the primeval waters still covered everything. If these stories bring you a sense of peace, consider subscribing or following, so we may continue to travel together on future journeys. But more than anything, your simple presence here listening is enough for me to keep telling the tale. The wind brushes across jagged stones as if murmuring a secret. Against the pale gray sky, a broken statue of a god remains, only half a face still intact. Yet its stone eyes keep gazing at the horizon as though they have never closed. There is no sound except for the sand sliding over rock, silent, persistent. The desert seems to guard its secrets better than any human ever could. Beneath thick layers of dust, beneath towering blocks of stone, and the long shadows of pyramids, lie stories that were never spoken in words. And if the gods once lived, surely they lived here. Not upon Olympus, not in eternal white clouds, but in this very place where the sun burns away every illusion and the night's cold feels like the stare of death itself. It may sound like madness, but perhaps it is worth considering. If the gods were real, then this world, our world, might be their project. A design sketched with light water and the first taste of loneliness. This question is not new. In fact, it was asked more than 5,000 years ago by those who lived along the Nile. They did not write philosophy books or prove their ideas with theorems. They told stories, and in those stories, the world did not begin with a bang or with light. It began with silence. There was no sky, no earth, no bounds, no boundary to define anything. Only an unnamed space, a thick unconsciousness, heavy as water, dark and without form. Yet in the imagination of the ancients, that emptiness was not absence, but a fullness waiting to be opened. Like a breath held too long. Like a thought not yet born trembling beneath the surface of awareness. Then something emerged. Not a person, not a shape, but a point of awakening. An idea rising from the nameless. A flicker of recognition. Perhaps the gods, if they exist at all, did not come from anywhere. They were born out of the loneliness of a universe that had not yet discovered itself. No one could name that first being. Later, the Egyptians would speak of a primeval god. But in that moment, only one thing took place: presence. Life began not with movement, but with the sheer awareness of being. No need for light. No need for language. Just 1 second of touching itself in an infinite sea of darkness. The desert understands this. It knows that loneliness is not a void, but a pressure, a solitude deep enough to give birth to a universe. The wind still moves through cracks in the mythic stones. The statues are broken, their bodies incomplete. Yet in the dim light of dawn, you may notice something is still stirring. A whisper without sound, like water dripping onto dry sand. Have the gods ever truly left this place? Or are we the ones who have forgotten them? And if a single drop of water once gave birth to the world, what happens when it dries away? Who breathed out the first wind into the darkness? Could a god come into being without another to bring them forth? And why did the world begin with a breath and not a voice? Step further, for the greatest questions of life and death, love and betrayal were all once whispered by sand and water. Before the very first breath, there was only an unnamed ocean, deep still and dark as eyelids that had never opened. The Egyptians called it Nun. They did not imagine the world born from an explosion, nor from a battle between a god of light and a demon of darkness. To them, it began with a primeval sea, silent as stone, without shore, without bottom. No form, no color. Only the quiet presence of water and darkness woven together, like a silence that had never been broken. Within Nun there was no direction, no sky, no wind, no time, not even death, for there was no life yet to be lost. Try to picture it. A world where everything drifts, yet nothing flows. Where everything sinks, yet nothing has shape. Where all possibilities lie, asleep like seeds, buried deep in cold soil, waiting for an awakening without a name. And then, in a way, no one could explain the first being appeared. Atum, not born, not created, he simply was. In that vast and nameless expanse, Atum rose like a heartbeat of awareness within unconsciousness. Not light, but the first recognition. Not form, but a question without words. He did not ride clouds. He did not wield thunder. He did not roar like a lion at the head of the pack. Atum simply breathed, and that was the first breath of the universe. From that very breath, Shu was created the god of air, a sudden sneeze like the reflex of a being holding silence for too long. Then a deeper convulsion rose from the gut, and thus Tefnut was born the goddess of moisture of mist of the first drop of water falling upon a ground not yet called earth. You may smile at the thought of gods being born through something as crude as vomiting. But for the Egyptians, this was no accident. It was the most honest language they knew, sneezing, retching, those raw, biological gestures that come before words where emotion touches flesh. Air, moisture. These are the two foundations without which life cannot begin. And it all started with a god who did not want to be alone. Shu was the first distance, the boundary between things that had never taken form, the divider that allowed difference to exist so that this would not dissolve into that. Tefnut was the first drop of water, the moisture in your throat when you are not yet speaking, but already longing to give voice, the softness that kept the world from being nothing but silent stone. When Shu and Tefnut came into being, the world still had no shape, no color. Yet the possibility of shape and color began to stir. Space opened. Separation began. And that was the moment light could be imagined, even if it had not yet appeared. There was no war between gods and demons, no triumph of good over evil. Only a loneliness stretched too long, compelling a being to create parts of itself, just so it would no longer be alone. Atum did not call Shu and Tefnut by name. He called them with longing, a strange yearning for something he had just brought forth. A silent summons across a sea without sound, and the world trembled for the first time. It was as if even darkness shuddered, realizing it was no longer everything. But what happens when those first beings lose each other? Who will be the one to seek? And can the word love exist among gods who have not yet known pain? Atum was not born in light, yet it was his loneliness that opened the path for light to be imagined. When Shu and Tefnut separated from Atum, the universe gained distance for the first time. There was here and there, near and far, breath no longer held within the chest, but drifting colder, freer, and emptier. Atum looked into that emptiness, and for the first time, he was no longer everything. No one tells us what Atum felt, but if a god had ever known the chill of the mind, it would have been at that moment. Not the cold of lacking warmth, but the cold of realizing I am no longer whole. And in Egyptian mythology, this stands as one of the most mysterious origins. From solitary completeness came separation. And from separation came the Creator's own sense of absence. This was not a tragedy. It was the truth of all life. You cannot bring something into being without leaving a part of yourself inside it. Shu. The air rose upward. Tefnut. The moisture dissolved back into the waters. They went somewhere into a realm Atum had never named. And he waited. He waited for the first sound to return. The world then had no day or night. But in Atum's mind, a faint notion began to take shape: time. For time, after all, is only felt when we are waiting for something to come back. He sat in the darkness, not the same darkness as before, but one already marked by absence. This darkness was no longer warm. It felt like a room you know you once belonged to, yet now something has left it, never to return as it was. He called out. Not with words. Atum had no language. But the very idea of calling, of a fragile connection between beings, began to stir. And that was the moment light was conceived. Not light as we know it, radiant blazing, but a thin thread as fine as a strand of hair, faint as golden dust in the air. A light that could exist only if there was distance, emptiness, something through which it could pass. Atum did not create the sun. What he created was the possibility of light itself, air moisture, and distance. In Egyptian mythology, this was the beginning of what would one day become the sky, the earth, and the generations of gods that followed. But before all of that, it was only a feeling, the sense of having lost something precious, precisely because you loved it enough to let it go. Shu and Tefnut did not return, and Atum felt fear. This was the first time in the universe that an emotion called fear existed. Not fear of an enemy, but fear of losing what had once been part of himself. He cast his gaze outward, searching. But the world had no light. He listened, but there was no sound beyond his own, and it no longer echoed as before, for there was no one to respond. Then, in a way no story fully explains, Shu and Tefnut returned. The Egyptians never said where they went or what they had done, but they came back, and they carried with them something altered, like someone stepping out of the rain with the scent of earth still clinging to them, like a dreamer returning from sleep with eyes that will never look quite the same. Atum rejoiced. From that gratitude he wept, and the Egyptians said the tears of Atum shed in reunion with Shu and Tefnut fell upon the ground, and from them humanity was born. You may choose to believe this or not, but pause for a moment and consider if our lives began from tears, what might that mean? Perhaps it was not light, but emotion that first allowed the universe to sense itself alive. If a god was once lonely enough to cry, then that was the moment when the first seeds of humanity were sown. And if human beings were born from divine tears, perhaps we can glimpse ourselves not in the mirror, but in the trembling reflection of a single drop of water glistening on dry sand. But Shu and Tefnut did not stop there. They would give birth to other forces greater in form and shape, and to separations deeper even than the first loneliness. Are you ready to step into the first map of life, where the sky and earth were divided by the very bodies of the gods? They returned, Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. After a mysterious journey no story ever fully told, came back to Atum. Yet they did not return the same. Their absence had transformed them like seeds, splitting open after a long burial in the soil. And from their union, two new beings were born: Nut, the goddess of the sky, and Geb, the god of the earth. For the first time in Egyptian mythology, the world gained form. No longer only darkness and water. No longer only breath and idea, but beings with names, with bodies, with scent and touch. Nut the daughter, her skin, the deep indigo of twilight, her body arching in a great curve like the dome of heaven. Geb the sun with skin the red-brown of fertile earth, his back twisting in the contours of the Nile's flow. They loved one another, not in words, but in touch. Their bodies entwined sky and earth as one. Atum watched, and something within him stirred uneasily. Not because of the love between his children, but because their union erased all boundaries. Once again, everything was melting back into the formless beginning. He feared the world would collapse into chaos. So, Atum commanded Shu, the god of air, to do what no one had ever done before: separate the sky from the earth. And Shu, with his towering body and arms, long as the wind, stepped between the two lovers. He placed his hands upon Nut and lifted her upward. A gentle gesture, yet one that shook the very foundations. Nut's body arched, her gaze bent downward toward the lover from whom she was torn. Her arms and legs stretched across the horizon, and Geb, lying below, pressed his face into the soil, arms outstretched, unable to touch her. The Egyptians believed this moment created the sky we see each day. The heavens did not fall, the earth did not break apart. Air held them apart, a painful, necessary distance, and with that distance, time began to flow. Day and night could exist. The sun could travel across Nut's body, sink beneath her feet, and rise again. Shu stood between them, choosing neither side. Air has no shape of its own, yet it is what allows everything else to hold its shape. When you take a deep breath in the open fields, when the wind runs through your hair, and the scent of damp grass blends into the air, that was the feeling the ancients believed to be the scent of Shu, the scent of distance, of separation, of space in which life can exist. Have you ever wondered, if the sky truly bends down to watch us, what keeps it from falling, from crushing the earth, from pressing everything into dust? It is not a pillar, not a god of thunder, only air. The Egyptians did not build their myths out of battles. They built them out of balance, just enough distance so that things would not dissolve into each other, but not so far apart that they lost their bond. And so the first map of life was drawn. Above was Nut arched like the dome of night. Below was Geb, fertile cracked, ever generating. Between them was Shu, the one who kept all things from sliding back into chaos. There was no victory, no defeat. Only distance and a love interrupted. Yet there was something Atum did not foresee. Nut and Geb, though separated, continued to love each other. Beneath Nut's belly, upon Geb's chest, they still exchanged gifts of life. Strange seeds carrying the shapes of new gods, Isis, Osiris, Set, and Nephthys. Love, it seems, always finds a way, even when touch is no longer possible. However, their children did not inherit the balance of their parents. Each would embody either a whisper or a scream, a vow or a blade. And when these young gods began to argue, to love, to betray one another, the order that had only just been drawn began already to tremble. You have seen Nut arched across the heavens and Geb lying beneath. But have you ever wondered what might unfold in the empty space between them? Nut the sky, though torn apart from her lover, Geb never ceased to send her gifts down to the earth beneath her. Not with hands, not with words, but through the quiet movements of life itself. Across the distance that seemed impossible to bridge, she gave birth to the gods, Isis, Osiris, Set, and Nephthys. They would become the central figures in a divine tragedy. Some myths even speak of great Horus, a sky god born in the same age, but in most versions his presence fades quickly. That is why in the stories passed down the focus falls most often on the four bound together in the great drama of Osiris. There was no cry at birth, no cradle to welcome them. They were born as the inevitable consequence of a love divided, each carrying within them a fragment of emotion that had never been fully expressed. Isis, goddess of magic and wisdom, had eyes like a morning lake, neither loud nor piercing, yet enough to make anyone who looked into them feel laid bare. She spoke little, but every being longed for her understanding. Within her was something that made the world feel protected. Osiris, god of life, harvest, and order, was different. Tall, composed, and carrying within him a nameless sorrow. From the moment of birth, he sensed a responsibility larger than himself. When he laid his hand upon the earth, seeds sprouted. When he stepped into the waters, the weeds parted to let him through. Everything he touched began to live. Nephthys, sister of Isis, was the quietest of the four. Her beauty was like incense smoke at the end of a ritual, indistinct, fading, yet leaving a presence you notice only in its absence. She was her sister's shadow, a whisper that never became sound, the keeper of a flame in a room no one remembered walking into. And then there was Set, brother of Osiris. From the moment he was born, his face was unlike anyone else in the family. Long eyes, a stubborn jaw, and a hoarse laugh. Not like a child, not even like a god. Set was a desert wind. He was blinded by dust. He was in disorderly form. Not because he chose it, but because he had been born to be so. They grew up in a world still unfinished, a world where the sun was still learning how to rise and set on time, where the Nile had not yet mastered the rhythm of its floods, where humankind had not yet found its voice. The four siblings were the first sketches of personality in the universe. And like any family, they loved one another, though each in their own way. Isis and Osiris were bound together like light and warmth. They did not need to speak of their love. Simply by standing side by side, trees blossomed. The air softened and the earth grew tender beneath their feet. They were the first husband and wife not merely because they were kin, but because they listened to each other in a language beyond sound. Set was different. From childhood, he felt as though the world around him had not been made for him. Osiris was beloved. Isis was wise and gentle, and Nephthys was quiet and full of empathy. And Set always seemed unnecessary. He did not know why, only that at every feast, in every glance cast his way, there was always a distance he could not cross. So he began trying every way he could to be noticed breaking order, doing the unexpected leaving others unsettled. Not because he hated them, but because it was the only way they would see him, even if only with a troubled glance. Nephthys stood at the center of it all. She loved Set, not with passion, not with folly, but with a quiet acceptance, even knowing that such love would save no one, not even herself. From above, Nut, the sky, watched her children. Sometimes she let fall a few drops of water. People said it was rain, but perhaps it was tears. Atum by now was only a distant figure in the memory of the younger gods. The world had form, had seasons, had taste. Yet form did not mean peace. For where love exists, hurt begins. No one remembered who spoke first. But one day, Set looked at Osiris longer than usual, and Osiris, instead of embracing his younger brother, as in years past, simply nodded and turned away. It was a fleeting moment, yet enough to carve the first crack so small no one noticed. And you know how cracks begin, with a glance out of rhythm, with a laugh that fails to meet another heartbeat, with a distance no one meant to create, but once born, it only grows. They had not yet quarreled, not yet betrayed. No blood had been shed, but something had begun to take shape, a feeling that even gods cannot escape the sense of being left behind. And when a god feels unseen, what do you think will follow? Among the children of Nut and Geb, Osiris was the first to change the fate of humankind. Not through force, not through fear, but through the gentle touch of his hand upon the earth. The Egyptians believed Osiris was the first god who knew how to turn barren soil into fertile ground. Wherever he walked, barley sprouted grapes, ripened into wine, and thorn bushes bent aside to make way for fields. He did not shout, nor wield hammer or spear. Osiris simply listened to the soil, to the water, to the soft winds that heralded the coming floods. They said that before Osiris, humans lived like animals. They fought over scraps of meat, drank rivers dry, and abandoned the land once it was barren. They did not know how to plant, how to keep, or how to share. But Osiris taught them that seeds were not only for eating, but for sowing again. Those rivers were not only for drinking, but for filling the fields with harvest. Perhaps this is why Osiris was always depicted in green, the color of new shoots of renewal. On ancient statues, his face is painted deep green, as though his very body was a field that would never die. When people worshipped Osiris, they were not only honoring a god, they were honoring the promise that death was not an end, for even dead soil could bloom again. Isis was always by her husband's side. She was not only his wife, but also the clear eyes that helped him see further. Storytellers say Osiris had a kind heart, but it was Isis who taught him to turn kindness into law. Through her, humans learned how to live together, to share water, to save grain for the next season. Osiris gave them bread. Isis taught them how to keep bread for tomorrow. Gradually, under the guidance of Osiris and Isis, Egypt became a land of order. People stopped wandering aimlessly. They built villages, dug canals, and remembered the rhythm of the floods. They began to tell stories of death, not as a meaningless end, but as a doorway into another season. All because of this divine couple who sowed not only seeds, but also faith. Yet when one is loved too greatly, another is bound to feel left behind. The more Osiris was honored, the more Set felt himself cast aside. People praised Osiris as the father of civilization. But how many remembered that the dry winds of Set were also needed so the land would not rot? How many understood that without storms, the river would never awaken, never renew its skin? During the harvest festivals, people brought bread, wine, and fruit to place before the statue of Osiris. They sang songs, praising the grain hymns, celebrating the love of Isis. But in the shadowed corners, Set looked upon those offerings and saw only his own absence. No song called his name, no flower was laid for him. No one seemed to notice that sand was just as essential as water. Perhaps Osiris did not notice, or if he did not understand in time. He was too busy sowing, expanding, and teaching humankind. To him, Set was still a younger brother, hot-tempered, impulsive, but never truly a threat. He believed family ties alone could hold everything together in harmony. Yet, as you know, it is often that very trust that plants the seeds of tragedy. The Egyptians had a strange ritual. Each year, they shaped a figure of Osiris out of Nile mud, mixed with barley seeds, then let it decay in water. The statue would dissolve the seeds, would sprout, and from it, a new Osiris was born. It was their way of remembering that Osiris was not only the god of harvest, but also the embodiment of death, giving rise to life. But while the people rejoiced in the cycle of rebirth, Set saw something else. If death could only make Osiris stronger, then how could anyone ever stand against him? If everyone believed Osiris could not truly die, then what place was left for Set in his family, or in the world at all? The devotion of humankind to Osiris is planted in Set, in a bitterness unlike any he had ever known. The storm had not yet broken, but the wind had shifted, and when the wind changes, fire needs only the smallest spark. The story of Osiris is not only a tale of harvest, it is also a tale of faith and betrayal, but that will only reveal itself as we turn the next page. For on that very night, amid the feast of wine and songs praising Osiris, Set sat in the shadows and smiled a smile no one could read. Set had never been like his brother. Osiris bore the green of life, while Set wore the red of the desert. Osiris was greeted with joy wherever he went, while Set saw only sandstorms curling around his footsteps, as if trying to erase his very trace. With every passing flood, the people held festivals in honor of Osiris. They cast wreaths upon the river, poured wine into the earth, and sang hymns to the god of harvest and order. The name of Osiris echoed in prayers in the sharp taste of wine in every stalk of barley that bloomed. And Set, no song ever called his name. No wreath was ever given to the dry wind. No one lifted a cup to the desert storm. People remembered Set only when they wished the storm would pass, never once in gratitude for the rain that followed. In the shadows, Set watched. His anger did not erupt like fire, but smoldered like sand grain by grain, seeping into every crevice, slow yet impossible to shake off. Every praise for Osiris fell into Set's heart like another grain of sand, and when it grew too full, the desert itself would spill over inside him. "Does anyone see me?" Set asked no one in particular. It was a question pressed so tightly in his chest that at times it broke out as a hoarse roar. But no one answered. No one stopped. To them, Osiris was the harvest. Isis was magic, and Set, he was only the wind that tore rooftops away, the storm that shattered jars of water. In those moments, Set began to wonder, if the world sang only of his brother, then where did he belong? One great festival drew crowds to the riverbank. They shouted Osiris's name, offering bread, wine, and flowers. Set stood on the edge, his gaze sharp as a blade. No one invited him in. No one asked what he desired. So Set stepped into the river and scooped a handful of thick mud, the same black mud Osiris turned into fertile fields. But in Set's hand, it was only damp, pungent cold. He squeezed it tight until it crumbled through his fingers. If all this power belongs to him, Set thought, then what is left for me? He spoke to no one, but his actions began to speak for him. When the wind rose, it struck more fiercely. When sandstorms passed, they shattered more roofs than before. People began to whisper, "Is Set angry?" Yet they only whispered, then forgot, as if a storm were nothing more than chance. Only Nephthys, the quiet sister, noticed the change. She saw Set's eyes long and dark, as a deep abyss no longer carrying light. She longed to reach out to tell him, "You are not abandoned," but the words stuck in her throat like a breath that never became sound. Set still laughed. He still sat at the table with his siblings, lifted cups of wine, and listened to stories of harvests. But inside him, a desert had cracked open. And when the desert cracks, it waits only for a drop of water to turn into a flood. One night, Set stood upon a dune looking down at the village. Below, fire-flickered voices sang hymns to Osiris. The wind swept across his face, carrying the scent of smoke and wine. To Set's eyes, those were no longer songs of praise, but mocking laughter. No longer the smell of celebration, but the stench of being forgotten. One day, he whispered, "They will remember me, even if it is through blood." And so the first thought of conspiracy was sown. It had not yet become action. No blood had yet been spilled. But once a seed lies buried in the desert, the storm will surely come, and that storm would begin with a coffin. That harvest season, the fields ripened like golden waves, stretching endlessly across the land. The Nile flowed gently, dikes overflowed with fruit, and jars brimmed with wine. People thanked Osiris and sang praises to Isis. In their hearts, the world had never seemed so orderly. But at the edges of that order, a storm was waiting to break, and at its center stood Set. No one knew when he began to shape his plan. Perhaps on those nights he stood upon the dunes, staring down at the village lights, seeing only mockery in their glow. Perhaps when his hand crushed a lump of Nile mud and felt himself reduced to nothing but excess. Now, all of it had condensed into a single chilling scheme, the coffin. It was no ordinary coffin. Fashioned from rare wood, inlaid with gold, carved with such precision that every line shimmered under the torchlight. Yet its most terrifying feature was not its beauty, but its measure. It had been built to fit Osiris exactly. A magnificent bed and a deadly trap. Set announced a great banquet. Wine overflowed, flames blazed, music rose and fell like waves. Everyone who came believed it was a festival in honor of Osiris. No one suspected otherwise, not even Osiris himself. He sat at the center of the feast, smiling gently, raising his cup with his brother, unaware that he was already caught in a game of fate. At the height of the revelry, Set had the coffin carried in. All eyes turned toward it. Its beauty was so dazzling that the hall fell silent. A gift Set said, his voice hoarse yet magnetic. A bed for the one who fits it perfectly. Whoever lies within it shall be theirs. The hall erupted in delighted laughter. They treated it as a strange game. One by one, the gods and guests tried to lie inside. None fit. One was too tall, another too short, one too broad, another too narrow. Laughter rang out. More wine was poured, and curiosity grew. Who would be the one to match it? Set remained where he stood, his eyes fixed on his brother. He did not need to urge. He did not need to force. For Set knew that in the end, Osiris would step forward out of kindness, out of curiosity, and Osiris rose. With his gentle smile, he walked toward the coffin. Cheers erupted through the halls. Osiris, Osiris, try it. The room was alive with laughter and excitement. No one noticed the cold glint flashing in Set's eyes. Osiris lay down. And of course it fit. Perfectly. The coffin embraced his body, as if it had been made for him alone. Cries of astonishment rang out. Marvelous. It was born for you. At that instant, Set gave the signal. His accomplices rushed in, slamming the lid shut. The sharp clang of iron bolts echoed, slicing through music, through laughter, through every sound of joy. Outside, the banquet roared on. But inside the coffin, there was absolute silence. Darkness, thick and complete, without the faintest crack of light. The air slowly thinned. Osiris, the god of life, of harvest, was suddenly a prisoner inside a golden box. No light could reach him. Only the pounding of his heart filled the suffocating dark. And in that moment, Egypt's great tragedy began. For the coffin would not remain in the hall. It would drift away from Isis's embrace, away from the fields of grain, away from songs of praise. And when it vanished, the world itself would change color. But who would dare to seek it? When the coffin slammed shut, no one heard Osiris's cry. The feast went on. Wine still poured, music still swelled. Only when the night was over and the first rays of sun lit the hall did anyone realize Osiris was gone. From that moment, Isis knew the world had changed. She did not cry out loud. Her eyes were wet, yet steadfast. Her grief did not break her. It transformed into another force, a resolve to search. She began her journey wandering along the Nile through villages across cracked deserts. In every place, she asked, "Have you seen a coffin drifting by?" People only shook their heads or lowered their gaze. They feared Set, or perhaps they simply dared not interfere in the affairs of gods. Isis walked through the sharp scent of riverbank mud, through the cold dampness of the night, through the heavy odor of rooms that stored embalmed corpses. Death lingered everywhere in the thick incense of rituals mixed with the dryness of flesh and skin long gone. These smells clung to her hair and her garments, haunting even the brief dreams she had managed to steal along the way. They called Isis a goddess of magic, but on that journey, she was nothing divine. She was only a wife searching for her husband. Her feet bled on the burning sand. Her throat cracked dry in the wind. Each time she fell, she pressed her hands to the ground and rose again, as if her heart was dragging her body forward when her legs could not. Some nights, she dreamed of Osiris calling her name from within the coffin. The sound was not loud, but muffled, as if rising from deep underwater. She woke with her chest tightening, realizing it had been only a dream. Yet instead of despair, she took it as a clue. Osiris was waiting somewhere, and she must go on. The people along the Nile told stories. On certain evenings, they saw a figure in a long black robe walking the sandy banks, her hair caught by the wind, her eyes blazing with a search only she could understand. They knew it was Isis, but none dared call out to her. For those eyes were not meant for conversation, but for piercing through to the realm of death itself. At last, after many days, Isis reached a distant land where the coffin had lodged within the trunk of a great acacia tree. The tree had wrapped itself tightly around it, as if trying to shield Osiris. From afar, Isis knew it was him, for the air there carried a different scent, the mingling of wood and incense, both sacred and unsettling. She pressed her hand against the wood, and for the first time since his death, she allowed herself to weep. Her tears fell seeping into the tree's bark, as though sending a message to Osiris, "I have found you." But finding is not the same as reclaiming. The coffin was buried as if it had become part of the earth, and the tree itself impossible to move. And Set, the one who had sown the scheme, was still out there watching from afar, like a sandstorm that never ceases to whirl. Isis stood before this coffin, her heart both shattered and ablaze. She understood the journey was far from over. Finding Osiris was only the beginning. Keeping him and bringing him back would be the true battle. As night fell, she sat beside the coffin, listening to the wind whisper through the tree's branches. The breeze carried the resin's sharpness mixed with the scent of death, a blend that would chill the heart of any mortal. But to Isis, it was the fragrance of hope. For where there was scent, there was still a trace of life. And she swore, with all the power of love, that she would never let this coffin be lost again. But can one woman, even a goddess, truly keep Osiris safe against the fury of Set? Isis had found the coffin. Night after night, she sat beside it, singing softly, as though her lullabies might reach Osiris's soul. But before love could be made whole again, Set learned of it. For him, Osiris trapped in a coffin was not enough. As long as his brother's body remained intact, there was still hope that one day he might return. So Set came no longer hiding his fury. He tore open the coffin and dragged Osiris's body into the open. And in one of the most brutal acts of myth, he hacked his brother into pieces, scattering them across the land of Egypt. Some were cast into the river. Some are buried in the desert sand. Some were lost among the marshes of papyrus reeds. Each stroke was a Set's declaration. Osiris will never come back. Yet Isis did not collapse. Her grief did not harden into hatred, but into an extraordinary patience. She began a new journey to gather each fragment of her husband. Stories tell of her pushing through dense thickets of reeds, following the metallic scent of river water to find a piece of his flesh. In a small village, she caught the heavy fragrance of resins used to mask decay, and there another fragment of Osiris lay hidden. Piece by piece, she lifted them, cradled them, as though each were the whole man. A hand, a bone, a fragment. It did not matter. To Isis, every part still carried the soul of Osiris. Those who witnessed her did not see a goddess of magic, but a wife in her purest form, walking the length of Egypt tireless, simply to bring her husband home. When the final pieces were gathered, Isis used her magic to restore him. She wrapped the body in linen, anointed it with sacred oils, and chanted the oldest of words. The Egyptians believed it was from this act that the ritual of mummification was born, not merely to preserve the body, but to keep the soul on a path back to life. Osiris lived again. But it was not the life he once knew. He was no longer the king of the harvest, no longer walking through green fields, no longer sitting beside Isis at festivals. He returned in another form, transformed into the god of death. From that time on, Osiris ruled the underworld. It was not a realm of terror and darkness, but a kingdom where souls went after leaving the world of the living. There stood the scales of justice, the feather of the goddess Maat, and the promise of fair judgment. Any heart lighter than the feather would continue in peace, while any heart weighed down with guilt would be devoured. Osiris no longer walked the fields, yet the harvest still grew. The Egyptians believed it was his death that made the soil fertile. The flooding of the Nile was seen as his very flesh dissolving into the earth, so that every seed sprouting from it carried the spirit of the god. Isis had not lost her husband. She had kept Osiris, though, in another world. And from their love, she conceived Horus, the son who would inherit the path, who would one day face Set in a battle for justice. But that was a story for another age. For now, the world itself had changed. Death was no longer a meaningless void. It had become a doorway. And beyond that doorway, Osiris sat upon his throne, quietly awaiting each soul that passed through to judge them, to return the balance that Set had stolen. From then on, the Egyptians no longer feared death as before. They trusted that in the afterlife, Osiris was there, his deep green eyes fixed upon them, weighing each heart. Life and death were no longer severed from one another, but bound together like the Nile flowing endlessly from one season to the next. And in that silence, a promise rose from sand and water: life is never lost. It only changes form, seeking new ground in which to grow. Yet the love of Isis and Osiris was not ended, for beyond Horus was growing. And soon the world would witness a struggle, not only to reclaim a throne, but to answer a deeper question: can justice truly prevail over chaos. In the darkness, where Isis hid with the coffin, a new life was sown. She carried Horus, the final seed of love between herself and Osiris. He was not merely a child of divine blood, but a living promise justice would not die with his father. Isis concealed her son in desolate places among the reeds, by the river, in the cramped houses of common folk. She nourished him with milk and with whispered stories of his father. Horus grew up on those tales, how his father had been cut into pieces, cast into the river, yet how love had gathered him back again. Horus did not merely listen. He carved each detail into his heart like scars passed down through a blood. Set knew of the child, and Set feared him. For as long as Horus lived, there remained a flame waiting to ignite. So Set stalked him, sending venomous snakes, summoning storms, seeking every chance to kill the boy before he came of age. But Isis shielded her son with both magic and motherhood. She prayed to Thoth, god of wisdom, to heal his wounds when the snake struck. She prayed to Ra, god of the sun, to bring light when the night grew too heavy. And Horus survived again and again. The years passed, and Horus grew strong. His eyes shone like the sky itself. His falcon wings stretched wide, soaring across the desert. He was not only the son of Osiris, he was the very emblem of the heavens, gazing down upon the earth. And when his strength was full, Horus rose to challenge Set. "This throne is not yours. It belongs to my father, and now it belongs to me." So began the fiercest battles of Egyptian myth, not only with swords and spears, but with transformations, cunning, and magic. Sometimes they became beasts, tearing into each other amid the blinding sands. Sometimes they plunged into the river, turning the waters into their battleground. The people said that whenever thunder rolled, whenever the desert winds roared, it was Set and Horus locked once more in combat. The battle was not fought by two alone. It dragged on so long that the Council of Gods was forced to convene. Ra, Thoth, and many others gathered to judge between the two heirs. Justice, it seemed, was no simple matter, not even for the divine. At times, they leaned toward Horus, for he carried the blood of Osiris. At times, they leaned toward Set, for he too was the child of Nut and Geb, and he had ruled in power. Order trembled, not from lack of strength, but from lack of agreement. Horus was wounded many times. In one telling, he lost an eye in battle. Set tore it out and destroyed it. But Thoth found it, healed it, and returned it to Horus. From that moment, the eye of Horus became a symbol of protection and justice. An eye once broken, now shining brighter than ever. At last, after countless battles and endless judgments, the gods delivered their verdict. Horus was given the throne of Egypt. Osiris would not return to the living world, but his son would reign in his place. Set was not destroyed completely. He remained like the desert storm that never vanishes, but he was pushed back, subdued, forced to dwell at the margins of order. Horus ascended the throne, his falcon wings spreading across the land. The people rejoiced, for justice had at last been heard. Yet a question lingered in the wind. Was justice truly secure, or merely a temporary victory in the endless cycle between order and chaos? Isis looked upon her son, pride and worry mingling in her gaze. She knew every triumph is fleeting. Chaos never disappears. It only retreats, waiting. And in the underworld, Osiris sat in silence, watching from the shadows. He no longer walked the earth, yet his son's throne stood as proof that love, justice, and life, though torn apart, drowned, or broken, could rise again from dust and sand. Thus, the story of Osiris closes here, but it never truly ends. From his death and resurrection, the Egyptians learned this chaos can be driven back, but never erased. An order, if it is to endure, must be renewed each day, in every season, within every heart. Yet every struggle, whether ending in blood or injustice, requires someone to preserve it from being forgotten. And so while Horus claimed the throne, another god quietly took up the pen. It was Thoth who carved the first words of eternity. If the battle of Horus had lived only in memory, it would have faded like sand scattered by the wind. The Egyptians understood one truth: memory must be bound to signs, or else it will vanish. And so they told of a god who stepped forward to do this. Thoth. Thoth was unlike Osiris, or Set unlike Horus, with his mighty falcon wings. He bore the head of an ibis, his long dark eyes always cast downward, as though recording everything he saw. In his hand, he held a reed pen dipped in ink, writing upon papyrus, a fragile sheet yet strong enough to preserve the words of the gods. The Egyptians believed Thoth was born from the very light of Ra. In some tellings, he emerged from the head of the sun, a ray of wisdom meant to balance the darkness. In others, he was self-created for wisdom, needs no parents. It appears whenever the world requires one to remember. Beyond writing, Thoth was revered as the god who opened the arts of counting days, measuring hours, and calculating the seasons. Wisdom needs numbers, symbols, and rhythm. If Osiris taught humans how to sow, then Thoth taught them when to sow, when to reap, and when the river would rise. The sharp, earthy smell of ink and papyrus seeped into every chamber where scribes labored. That smell became the breath of knowledge. To the farmer, it was unfamiliar, but to the scribe, it was the scent of power. For whoever writes holds the memory of society itself. Thoth was never a noisy god. He did not step into battles. Yet in the councils of the divine, when disputes arose, Thoth was there in the corner, pen in hand, recording every word, not to choose a side, but to ensure that truth did not disappear. And so, a question echoed in the Egyptian mind: who truly decides fate, the one who wields the sword or the one who holds the pen? If Horus defeated, set by strength, it was Thoth who preserved that victory in words. For one day, when future generations no longer witnessed it, only writing would tell them what had truly happened. To ordinary people, the signs of Thoth sometimes looked like sorcery. A bird drawn on a wall, a circle, a jagged line. How could a few strokes contain an entire world? To them, writing was the whisper of the gods. And indeed, in Egyptian thought, writing was not merely a sign, it was alive like a seed sown into the earth. Picture it, a scribe bent over his table, oil lamp flickering faintly. The smell of ink stains his fingers, clings to his robe, and seeps into his lungs. He writes the name of a god, believing that the name has the power to summon the god's presence. He writes the name of an enemy, convinced it captures that soul to be judged. In Thoth's world, words did not describe truth. Words created truth. Thoth was also the god of justice. In the scene where Osiris judges the souls of the dead, it is Thoth who records the outcome of the scales. If a heart is lighter than the feather, Thoth inscribes the soul shall live in eternity. If a heart is heavy with sin, Thoth writes, the soul is devoured. Writing here was not only memory, it was judgment. It is said that when the quarrel between Horus and Set dragged on the council of gods often fell into deadlock, then Thoth did not shout, but each stroke of his pen became evidence. Thoth was silent wisdom, not seeking the spotlight, not needing hymns of praise, but without him the world would drift endlessly like a river without banks. And so the Egyptians called Thoth the keeper of balance, not by sword or spear, but by knowledge, not by brute force, but by the written word. If Osiris embodied life from the earth, and Horus embodied justice from the sky, then Thoth embodied memory, the only force that kept the world from forgetting itself. Yet a mystery lingers. Among the books said to be written by Thoth, there was one above all, the Book of Thoth. It was whispered that whoever read it would understand the entire universe. Did such a book ever truly exist? Or was it only a legend that lured people into endless searching? Let us follow the trail of that myth and see whether the book opens onto revelation, or whether it is only a mirage in the sand. In the silent temples where incense curled beneath high ceilings, priests whispered of a book so powerful that even the gods themselves regarded it with caution. They called it the Book of Thoth. Not an ordinary papyrus scroll, not a record of floods and harvests, but a singular volume said to contain the entire knowledge of the universe. The Egyptians said that within the Book of Thoth were spells capable of raising the dead, of speaking with animals, of reading the hidden thoughts in another's heart. To master its lines was to wield the power of a god. Yet there was always a price, and no one could say clearly what that price was. Imagine a young priest late at night secretly unrolling an ancient scroll. The oil lamp flickers, the air heavy with the sharp smell of ink and the mustiness of old papyrus. He begins to read the twisted symbols, and suddenly the room trembles. A draft sweeps through, a strange hissing sound, as though the world itself had cracked open a seam. In panic, he rolls the scroll shut, but from that moment on, sleep will never come easily again. Knowledge, when it exceeds the vessel of a human mind, becomes a burden. It was whispered that the book was hidden where no hand could reach it, at the bottom of the Nile, sealed in an iron chest, the iron chest placed within a golden one, the golden one locked inside a wooden box, the wooden box walled within a temple of stone, layer upon layer, to keep it from being grasped by humans. For knowledge, when misused, could turn into destruction. In some versions, even the pharaohs sought it. They believed that with the Book of Thoth, they could rule not only Egypt, but also the souls of the dead. One king, it was said, dug relentlessly until he uncovered an ancient book in a deep tomb. He read only a few pages before disaster struck. His kingdom fell to drought, his family was torn apart, and he himself died in despair. The people whispered that this was Thoth's punishment. Wisdom is never meant for those who try to possess it. Strangely, across thousands of years, even though no one has ever been certain of its existence, the book was always spoken of, like a lingering shadow, like a dream that never fades. Perhaps It was that very uncertainty that gave it power. Humans, more than any other creature, are haunted by what they cannot grasp. And on another level, perhaps the Book of Thoth was never a physical object at all. Perhaps it was a metaphor for human knowledge itself, a treasure, both liberating and perilous. With each generation, a new page is opened, bringing us closer to omniscience. Yet, at the same time, closer to the abyss where too much knowledge may crush the one who holds it. Ask yourself, if there were a book that revealed everything from future to past, from the secrets of the cosmos to the most private fears of your heart, would you dare to open it? Or would you let it rest, knowing that ignorance is sometimes a form of peace? The Egyptians chose to keep the book within myth, neither affirming nor denying. They let it exist as a warning. Knowledge can save, but it can also destroy. And Thoth, in their imagination, always smiled quietly, as though he knew that no one was ever truly ready to read all that he had written. And so the question lingers, was the book real? Or was it only a mirage crafted by the human mind to test itself? For if it was real, who would be bold enough or reckless enough to open it? If the Book of Thoth was the promise of absolute knowledge, then Thoth himself, in the Egyptian imagination, achieved something even stranger. He bent time. People did not picture Thoth as a warrior or a ruler. He appeared at night when the moon lit the sleeping fields. That moonlight was seen as the eye of Thoth, a heartbeat that pulsed in opposition to Ra's sun. If the sun measured the day, the moon measured the night. If Osiris ruled life after death, Thoth recorded every passing moment. Before Thoth, there was no calendar. No one knew how many days made a year, how many years made a life. But through watching the waxing and waning of the moon, through counting the rhythm of the river's flood, Thoth created the first calendar. 360 days plus 5 festival days, days beyond the year, reserved for the gods themselves. Farmers now knew when to sow. Priests knew when to perform rituals. Pharaohs knew when to ascend the throne and when to make offerings that aligned with the will of heaven. Without a calendar, society was a blind current. With a calendar, the world gained rhythm like a song written in numbers. But time was not only measured, it was reshaped. One legend tells that when the goddess Nut was cursed by Ra and forbidden from giving birth on any day of the year, Thoth played a game of dice with the moon. He won 5 new days, set beyond the 360. And in those extra days, Nut bore Osiris Isis, Set Nephthys, and the elder Horus. Without Thoth, they would never have been born, which meant that wisdom had slipped through the cracks of fate. Thoth did not break Ra's curse. He bent time to open another path. So the question remains, is time truly unchanging? Or is it only a kind of symbol, something that can be stretched, shaped, or even rewritten by the one who knows how to count and inscribe? The Egyptians, when they looked to the sky, saw the sun rise and set the moon wax and wane. They understood the universe as a cycle with no true beginning and no final end. Thoth was the one who gave that cycle shape, turning it into a calendar, turning repetition into order. In their writings, Thoth was called the keeper of eternal memory. Not because he lived forever, but because he preserved everything from being lost. A second that passed was gone forever to mortals. But for Thoth, it was written down, placed in the drawers of time. In the Egyptian world, nothing that had happened was ever truly gone, so long as there was wisdom enough to open it again. This draws us to a deeper truth. Is not every religion born from humanity's obsession with measuring eternity? The Egyptians counted days by the moon. The Babylonians mapped the stars. The Jews inscribed their sacred calendar. The Greeks conceived of Kronos, the god of time. In each system, people sought to anchor themselves in a cycle to avoid being swallowed by infinity. If so, then Thoth was not merely the god of Egypt. He was the embodiment of an eternal human longing to turn what cannot be measured into something that can be written. But when people believed they had grasped time, they also found themselves bound by it. The calendar secured the harvest, but it also locked human life into rigid frames. We think of ourselves as free, yet in truth, we walk to the rhythm of the numbers Thoth set long ago. So what did Thoth truly give humanity, a gift or a cage of symbols? The answer is not simple. For after Thoth, knowledge began to transform into power and also into danger. And that is where the story now leads us. When knowledge is misused, it becomes a curse. There were nights people believed when Thoth still walked the corridors of Egypt's temple libraries. His ibis feet touched the stone floors lightly, his moonlit eyes scanning each papyrus scroll. He did not speak, he only looked. And that gaze was a reminder: knowledge is not always a gift. It can be a curse. In the oldest inscriptions, writing itself was seen as carrying a soul. A priest who wrote a god's name incorrectly might face punishment for a wrong sign was the same as calling the wrong spirit. A scribe who copied a spell with even a single stroke missing could find the magic turning back upon him. Even in those early days, the Egyptians understood that knowledge misused can devour the one who holds it. Yet human desire never ceased. Thousands of years later in Greece, the name of Thoth was given a new cloak, Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes, the thrice great. In this guise, Thoth was no longer just an Egyptian god, but the ancestor of all esoteric sciences: alchemy, astrology, and mystical philosophy. Texts attributed to Hermes, the Corpus Hermeticum, spread across the Mediterranean. Readers believed they held not just a religion, but the very key to unlock the universe. The flame did not die. In the 12th century, as the Knights Templar traveled through the Middle East, many believed they had encountered Hermetic writings, perhaps even lost books from ancient Egypt. Rumors spread they had learned the secret of alchemy's stone. They guarded the knowledge of immortality. They carried the very curse Thoth had once written down. No one knew the truth. But the ambiguity itself turned them into legend and gave reason for their destruction. In medieval Europe, when darkness fell over, learning the name of Hermes Thoth returned as a promise. Those who whispered incantations, those who tinkered with formulas to turn lead into gold, believed they were following the traces of the ibis-headed god. Yet once more, knowledge was not used for illumination, but for possession, for manipulation, for the attempt to transcend human limits. And the result, more often than not, was only ashes. There are writings that claim anyone who touched the Book of Thoth paid a price, a loss, a death, or a descent into madness. No one escaped. Perhaps these were merely warnings dressed in myth, but perhaps they revealed a deeper truth, that the greater the wisdom, the longer the shadow it casts. Think of this. Why were Hermetic texts always called secret? because they were never meant for the many. If everyone held the same power, order would dissolve. Thoth, in the imagination of the Egyptians, never forbade humans to learn, but he left behind a hidden trap. Those who learn too much too quickly stumble over the weight of their own knowledge. In the temples of Egypt, the smell of ink and resin was bound to memory. But in the dungeons of medieval Europe, that same scent turned to smoke and ash when the accused burned their books in fear of the stake. The same knowledge yet in Egypt, it was the memory of the gods, while in Europe, it became evidence of sorcery. This forces us to ask, is knowledge itself dangerous or only the way humans use it? If a knife can cut bread as well as kill, is the fault in the blade or in the hand that holds it? The Egyptians answered in their own way. They placed knowledge in the hands of Thoth, letting the god keep it safe, allowing humans to touch only what was needed. The Greeks, the medieval Europeans, they tried to seize it and then trembled before what they possessed. Perhaps this is why stories of the Book of Thoth endure. Not so that the book might be found, but so that people remember some doors are not meant to be opened, or at least not opened too soon. And in the shadows of the temples, perhaps Thoth still smiles. Not a gentle smile, but the knowing smile of one who sees ahead, that humanity will always seek and always stumble for. That is its nature. But should wisdom truly be forbidden? Or is it precisely through danger that humans learn the value of justice and balance? Perhaps that is why, in the oldest legends, there was always a whisper that lingered. Remember, but do not reveal. Sometimes silence itself is the only way to preserve order in the world. In the temples of Egypt, offerings were not given only to the gods. Secrets, too, were offered. On stone walls, symbols break off mid-line. On papyrus, scrolls sentences trail into silence. Modern scholars call them fragmented texts. Yet some believe it was Thoth himself who left these gaps, for not all knowledge was meant to be spoken. Thoth was never the god of thunder or wrathful fire. He appeared quietly in moonlight, in the scratch of a reed pen across papyrus. If Ra was the blinding sun, Thoth was the drop of dew at dusk. And sometimes a whisper is stronger than a shout, for it does not vanish instantly, but clings to memory, slipping into dreams. In the shadowed halls of the temples, priests pass down a single warning: remember, but do not reveal. Not all wisdom was meant to be shared. A spell mispronounced could turn into a blade. A formula in the wrong hands could shatter order instead of sustaining it. Some truths must be held in silence so that balance might endure. Yet silence did not mean loss. For the Egyptians, knowledge was like the sun. It set each night, but never disappeared. It sank beneath the earth only to rise again. What was hidden today could return tomorrow in another cycle. Silence, then, was also a form of preservation, waiting for the right moment to be reborn. They tell of a final priest in a temple crumbling to ruin. He scribbled a few last signs, then hid the scroll deep within a crack of stone. No one knows what he wrote. Perhaps a secret, perhaps only a prayer. But from that moment, knowledge was no longer mere words. It became a whisper waiting for the right cycle to rise again. That is the essence of Thoth memory. Not memory for display, but memory to preserve balance. He knew that if everything were revealed at once, the world itself would tilt. So he left fragments, forcing humankind to learn patience, to piece things together, and most importantly, to learn silence. Some may feel disappointed. Why do myths leave gaps, conceal, stop halfway? Yet it is precisely this concealment that keeps them alive. A secret fully decoded fades quickly, but a secret left unfinished lingers for millennia, always stirring the same question: what was hidden? Perhaps this is the lesson for us today. Not all knowledge exists to be possessed. Some knowledge exists only to stir reflection. Some silences are not empty, but pauses rests in the score before a new melody begins. Thoth did not only leave behind writing and calendars. He left behind a way of living, whispering, withholding, waiting for the cycle to turn. And when his part of the story closes, there is no grand finale. Only dim moonlight, a sentence cut short, and a silence. That silence is not an ending. It is a threshold to another turning of the wheel. For knowledge, like the sun, may set, but it will rise again. It may vanish only to return. There is knowledge that helps humankind master the world, and there is knowledge that reminds us the world was never truly ours to own. And so, after Thoth's whisper fades, the story carries us elsewhere to the realm where gods die each night, only to be reborn with every dawn. If you asked an ancient Egyptian, will the universe ever end? They would look at you in surprise. For in their imagination, there was no end of days. The world did not collapse into ruin, sink into eternal night, or explode into silence. Instead, the world simply repeated itself, like the sun that fell each evening only to rise again the next dawn. Remember, Egyptian civilization was nourished by the Nile, and the Nile never flowed in a single rhythm. It had its season of flood and its season of drought. The waters withdrew, the land cracked, and death seemed certain. But then the flood returned, laying down silt, and life rose up greener than before. To the Egyptians, death was simply a season, and every season always came again. In the fields, they saw barley bowing low, its grain dying in the earth. Yet from that death, new shoots burst forth brighter and stronger. In the rhythm of sowing and harvest, they read a truth: death was not an ending, but the beginning of another cycle. Their mythology pulsed with this same rhythm. Osiris died, yet from his death, Isis brought forth Horus. Horus grew fought, set, and restored order. Each generation of gods, each battle did not close the story, but turned it. Death did not erase it, only shifted the world's beat. Unlike the Mesopotamians who feared great floods that could wipe away all life, the Egyptians saw certainty. Everything would return. They did not craft visions of apocalypse, but of exchange day and night, flood and drought, life and death. In the sky, they imagined the goddess Nut swallowing the sun each night, only to give birth to it again the next morning. An endless cycle with no true end. And if you asked them about the end of the world, they might have laughed and said, "The end of the world is only the day you do not see the sun rise." Ra, the sun god, was the very soul of that eternal cycle. Some myths say he was born from Atum. Others say that he rose from a great lotus blooming upon the primeval waters of Nun. Whatever the version, all agreed on one truth. When Ra opened his eyes, the first light flared forth, and with it, time began to flow. Yet that light carried a promise as well. It would vanish each evening only to test whether it could return by dawn. From this philosophy, the Egyptians drew an unshakable faith. They did not fear death as a final ending, but prepared for it as one prepares for a journey. A tomb was not a pit of despair, but a house for the voyage beyond. The scent of resin used for embalming, the chisel striking against a coffin's wood, all were preparations, not farewells. In funeral rites, there was no wailing for an ending. There were blessings for continuation. We will meet again at the dawn of the next life. That was the spirit engraved into every word, every prayer, every wall of stone. Here, a deeper reflection arises. If all things only repeat, then what is the meaning of a single life? Is existence nothing more than endless recurrence? The Egyptians did not answer with philosophy, but with a symbol, ma'ati, the principle of order and balance. Within the cycle, each person bore the responsibility to keep harmony. If one link faltered, the wheel itself would break. Thus, death was not the terror. The true fear was imbalance, the collapse of the eternal rhythm. And so another question stirred. If the sun always returns, where does it go during the night? The Egyptians had their answer. They believed that at every sunset, the sun entered the underworld, journeying through caverns of monsters and trials. Each night, Ra had to fight to pass through darkness, and each dawn, the rising of the sun, was not a certainty, but a hard-won victory. We too will walk that journey. For in the eternal cycle, every night opens into both tragedy and miracle life, passing through death so that creation may begin again. For the Egyptians, sunset was never just the sun slipping beyond the horizon. It was the death of Ra. The sun god keeper of clarity and order sailed his boat across the sky each day. But as darkness fell, the boat plunged westward and vanished into the mouth of the goddess Nut. Night was not restful. Night was a battle. In Egyptian imagination, when the sun set, Ra entered the Duat, the underworld. It was not an empty void, but a vast realm of hidden rivers, guarded gates, and monstrous creatures. Each of the 12 hours of the night marked a perilous passage. At every gate, a new trial awaited. On coffins and tomb walls, they carved maps of this shadowed world. Rivers of fire burned with acrid smoke. Lakes of black water lay still, reeking cold and metallic like blood. Serpents coiled across the pathways, vast and menacing. And at the heart of it all was the greatest enemy, Apophis, the colossal serpent embodiment of chaos itself. Each night, Apophis sought to swallow the solar boat whole. And each night, Ra fought with the help of other gods, sometimes even Set, the very symbol of disorder, who here wielded a spear against the serpent's flesh. Through their struggle, the boat pressed on, and light held its chance to return. The Egyptians did not treat this as a metaphor. For them, dawn arrived only if Ra prevailed. So when night winds howled, when heavy clouds smothered the sky, they feared Apophis was devouring the sun boat. And when the morning light was late to break the horizon, their hearts tightened had Ra failed this time. Now place yourself in their world. Each sunrise was not just nature's routine. It was sacred proof of triumph. The dew upon the grass, the call of waking birds, the damp scent of soil after nightfall. These were not ordinary signs. They were evidence that Ra had pierced through the underworld cut open the belly of the great serpent and returned once more. For the Egyptians, each day was a miracle. Nothing was guaranteed. The world might unravel on any given night should Ra fall. Sunrise was a gift, but also a reminder. The cosmos endured only through a battle endlessly repeated, never finally won. Within this belief, human death ceased to be an ending. If Ra could die each evening and be reborn each dawn, then the death of a person was simply part of a larger cycle. The dead entered the Duat, faced their trials, and awaited rebirth at another dawn in another form. This philosophy seeped into every corner of Egyptian life. When they buried their loved ones, they placed amulets and carved guiding words as if preparing them for a nocturnal voyage. They believed, just as Ra did, that every soul must pass through darkness in order to find the light. Yet there was something strange about this cosmic war Ra never won, once and for all. Apophis was never destroyed completely. Each night, the serpent rose again, swallowing the solar boat anew. This was not a story with a conclusion, but a cycle. The world survived not by decisive victory, but through relentless persistence. Here lay the Egyptians' fundamental difference from many other cultures. For them, cosmic order was not a permanent achievement. It was a fragile balance remade each day. Existence rested not on permanence, but on repetition. If you have ever watched the sun rise after a long night, perhaps you know a fragment of what they felt. The first light cuts across the horizon like a wound torn open in the dark. Cold recedes, warmth returns. And in that moment, you know that at least today, Ra has triumphed. But what of tomorrow night? Could there come a day when Ra fails for good? That haunting question lived in the Egyptian mind, and it led to another part of the tale, the detailed journey of the sun through the underworld, where gods, souls, and monsters crossed paths in an eternal struggle. When the sun set, it was not merely darkness descending. In the ancient imagination, that moment marked the departure of Ra's solar boat from the sky, plunging westward through the gateway into the underworld, the Duat. On the tomb walls of the pharaohs, maps were carved with chilling detail. They charted a 12-hour voyage, each hour a perilous stage. The Duat was no empty void, but a vivid realm, rivers of fire coursing with smoke, black lakes reeking of blood-reed fields where lost souls wandered, and massive stone gates guarded by beasts with the heads of serpents or crocodiles. Ra's boat, long and narrow, drifted down the subterranean river. At every gate, incantations had to be spoken to open the passage. If the words were wrong, the gate would not yield, and the boat would be trapped forever in shadow. That is why priests inscribed these spells on coffins and tomb walls, so the souls of the dead might read them, as if traveling alongside Ra on his nightly passage. But the journey was never peaceful. At every bend of the river, Apophis, the colossal serpent of chaos, waited. It lunged at the solar bark, coiling its body around the vessel, spewing foul breath thick enough to suffocate even gods. The imagined stench of sulfur and smoke painted on those walls still gives the sense of standing before a fiery abyss. And each night, Ra faced this terror again, never once with ease. And here lies a striking detail. The one who speared the serpent was not Osiris nor Horus, but Set. The very god of desert storms and disorder became the necessary ally. In the night, his violence was indispensable. Without Set's ferocity, the boat could not move forward. The Egyptians saw in this a profound truth. Even chaos in the right moment plays its part in sustaining order. Between each stage of the journey, Ra encountered countless souls. Some were carried forward on his boat because they had lived in harmony with the order of the world. Others were left behind in the swamps, where their cries rose like cold smoke. On the tomb paintings, we see them reaching out with hollow eyes and half-shadowed bodies. These images were not only for the dead, but for the living as well, a warning that all must step into the night one day. The passage through the 12 hours of darkness mirrored the rhythm of the heavens. Each hour carried its own landscape, its own trial, its own incantation. As midnight deepened, the shadows grew heavier, the enemies larger. The climax came at the 6th hour, when the boat passed through the womb of Nut, the goddess of the sky. Ra had to die in his old form, preparing for rebirth. That moment was without light, without song, only a heavy stillness, as if the universe itself held its breath. And then Ra was reborn now as Khepri the scarab, pushing the sun. The image was humble yet powerful. From the dark belly of the earth, a small creature rolled forward, the shining sphere pressing it toward dawn. No one can say why the ancients chose the beetle. Perhaps they saw in its brief life a symbol of eternal persistence. Each sunrise in the east was not simply the return of light. It was the end of a journey soaked in sweat and blood beneath the earth. It was Ra's victory and the serpent's temporary defeat. And most of all, it was proof that cosmic order still held, if only for one more day. In this vision, time was not a straight line ending in an apocalypse. It was a circle without end, death, struggle, rebirth. Today was not the continuation of yesterday, but the repetition of an eternal rhythm. So, when we look at the rising sun, we may think it is only another dawn. But for the ancients, it was a confirmation. The universe has not collapsed. Life still remains. A small miracle repeated endlessly, yet powerful enough to sustain faith for thousands of years. And from here, another question arises. If all life depends on this cycle, what holds it in balance? What keeps the wheel from breaking? The answer lies in a single fragile concept at the heart of Egyptian thought. Ma'at, the delicate order of the cosmos. In the tales of Ra's nightly voyage through darkness, one detail is often overlooked, yet it lies at the heart of it all. The solar boat did not carry light alone. It carried an idea, Ma'at. Ma'at was not just a goddess, though the Egyptians often portrayed her as a woman crowned with an ostrich feather. She was an idea, the very spirit of order. She was the balance that kept the universe upright, the rhythm that held the world in its orbit. Without Ma'at, the sun might rise but wander aimlessly. The Nile might flow, but it destroys instead of nourishes. On tomb walls, Ma'at was drawn as a single feather resting on a scale, a simple image. Yet it carried a profound truth. Everything in existence must be balanced. If one side grew too heavy, the scales would break and the world would collapse into chaos. And here is what makes Ma'at remarkable. She was never seen as eternal. The order was not solid like stone, but fragile as breath. It had to be renewed each day. That is why the pharaoh was not just a king, but the guardian of Ma'at. His duty was not merely to wield power, but to maintain balance between river and desert gods and mortals' life and death. Ancient texts often said, "The pharaoh offers Ma'at to the gods." This did not mean sacrifice. It meant commitment, the promise to keep the world in harmony. If the land fell into disorder, if crops failed, if war erupted, people believed it was because the pharaoh had failed his duty to Ma'at. Yet Ma'at was never reserved for kings alone. She lived in daily acts. A merchant who cheated a man who took more than his share, a judge who bent the law, all were said to break Ma'at. To speak truth, to keep a promise to share fairly, these were not just virtues. They were ways of living in alignment with Ma'at herself. In funerary rites, Ma'at revealed herself most clearly. When a soul entered the afterlife, it was not asked how wealthy it had been, nor how many temples it had built. Instead, it faced the weighing of the heart. In that chamber, the heart of the deceased was placed on one side of a great scale. On the other side lay the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was heavily laden with lies, sins, selfishness, it was devoured by Ammit, the monstrous eater of souls. But if the heart was light, it passed onward, granted life and eternity. The image is both simple and terrifying. No one else decides your fate but your own heart. There are no excuses, no advocates, no treasures to bribe the scales. Ma'at listens only to one truth, whether you lived in balance. And so Ma'at became the thread binding everything together, from Ra's nightly voyage to the pharaoh's throne, to the smallest meal or spoken word. The world endured only because balance was kept, and balance endured only when gods and humans held it together. It leaves us with a sobering thought. Perhaps the Egyptians understood earlier than most that the universe is not a fortress of stone, but a delicate scale. A single grain of sand could tip it. A single heavy heart could break it. When the feather of Ma'at touched the scale, the universe itself seemed to hold its breath. For in that fragile moment, the soul might rise into light or vanish forever into shadow. At the farthest edge of the duat, where darkness no longer growls but presses down in heavy silence, there waits a chamber for every soul. The hall of the weighing of the heart. There are no roaring fires here, no monsters in pursuit. Only the faint resin scent lingering in the air, torchlight stretching shadows across stone walls, and at the center, a great scale. On one side, the heart of the dead is placed, not a symbol, but the true heart itself, the vessel of memory, of feelings, of deeds. On the other side, lighter than a breath, rests the feather of Ma'at. The truth of a life is decided by that fragile comparison. If the heart is light, the soul moves onward. If heavier Ammit, the creature, part hippopotamus, part lion, part crocodile, devours it, erasing the soul forever. No rebirth, no second chance. For the heart writes its own record, and the scale only reads what is already inscribed. The Egyptians believed every word, every act pressed itself into the heart. A lie was like a stone dropped inside. Greed, like a lump of lead tied to it. The farther one strayed from Ma'at, the heavier the heart became. And on the day of judgment, no plea could save you, only the weightlessness you had carried within. Yet within the silence of that chamber lay something greater than personal fate, the conviction that the universe itself stood firm only so long as the scale remained in balance. Each heart light or heavy was not just about one soul, it was about eternal order. For thousands of years, Egypt lived with this belief. They built tombs, wrote texts, performed rituals, all for one truth: the heart of every person would meet the feather of Ma'at. But time did not pause. The Nile kept flowing and other empires came. First the Persians, then the Greeks, under Alexander and the Ptolemaic pharaohs. And when their feet pressed Egyptian soil, the scale of Ma'at did not vanish, but it began to be called by other names. Familiar gods put on new garments. Isis was worshipped in both Athens and Rome. Thoth was reborn as Hermes Trismegistus, patron of esoteric philosophy in the West. And from there, a new chapter opened. The scales no longer rested only in tombs of stone, but drifted into libraries, into philosophy, into foreign tongues. Ma'at did not die, but echoed with a different voice. The question was no longer, is the heart lighter than the feather? It became, when the gods are no longer called by their Egyptian names, do they still live on in human memory? And that is the threshold of the next part of the tale. The moment when the gods begin to fade and humankind remains to remember. When Alexander the Great marched into Egypt, the people did not resist. On the contrary, they opened the gates to welcome him. After centuries under Persian rule, they saw in the young Macedonian a new omen of fortune. Alexander journeyed to the temple at Siwa, where he was proclaimed son of Amun. From that moment, a conqueror from the west was crowned pharaoh in full Egyptian rite. After Alexander's death, one of his generals, Ptolemy, took the throne. Thus began the Ptolemaic dynasty, lasting nearly 3 centuries. This was a different Egypt pharaohs who spoke Greek, a court shaped by Western customs, yet the temples of Isis, Osiris, and Horus still filled with incense and prayer. The Greeks did not abolish Egypt's faith. They blended it. In Isis, they saw Demeter, goddess of the harvest. In Osiris, they recognized Dionysus, lord of wine and rebirth. Horus, the falcon of the sky, was likened to Apollo. In Thoth, the keeper of writing and wisdom, became Hermes, not just Hermes, but Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. Through this mingling, the Egyptian gods did not vanish. They endured in new guises. Sculptors carved Isis with Greek softness, her face serene, her hair in gentle curls. Priests raised temples to Serapis, a god newly born woven from Osiris Sapis and the Greek Zeus. Serapis became the emblem of this union, rooted in Egypt, yet speaking in Greek. And in Alexandria, the city Alexander founded, the great library rose. There, Egyptian papyri were translated into Greek. Ancient myths found new words, and through them, the memory of the gods drifted beyond the desert sands into the heart of the Mediterranean world. And yet within all that splendor, something had shifted. Belief was no longer what it once had been. For the ancient Egyptians' worship was breath itself, the condition of survival. However, for the Greek rulers, the gods were often political symbols. To equate Osiris with Dionysus was not only an act of faith, but also a strategy, a way to make two civilizations accept one another. Still along the villages scattered by the Nile, people whispered their prayers to Isis for family protection, sprinkled barley flour in Osiris's rites, and retold the tale of Horus against Set to lull their children to sleep. In the palaces above, religion became politicized, but among the people below, devotion endured. Perhaps this dual rhythm is what made Ptolemaic Egypt so strange a civilization with two layers. On the surface, the gods spoke Greek, wore Greek garments, and stepped into the discourse of Western philosophy and politics. But in the soil itself, where sand and river met, they still murmured in the old tongue. Walk into the temples raised under the Ptolemies, like the temple of Isis at Philae, and you will see it clearly. Hieroglyphs carved deep into the stone stand side by side with Greek inscriptions. An ancient rite spoken in a new language. It was as if the two cultures were holding up a mirror to one another. But one truth is undeniable. From this point onward, the Egyptian gods were no longer the heritage of a single people. They had become part of the Mediterranean world. And with that came a paradox. The more they were shared across cultures, the more their roots began to dissolve. One day the temples would fall silent. The old languages would cease to be spoken. And yet Isis and Osiris would still be remembered, not wholly as themselves, but as signs carried forward by a different current. Here, the story takes a curious turn when Thoth became Hermes' Egyptian wisdom, reshaped itself into Western esoteric philosophy. This was not merely a translation of words, but the rebirth of a god beneath a different cloak. In the centuries of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Egypt was no longer just the land of pyramids and mummies. Alexandria rose like a jewel on the Mediterranean coast, crowned with a lighthouse that burned day and night, and a great library that guarded hundreds of thousands of scrolls. It was here that a quiet transformation unfolded. Thoth, the Egyptian god of writing and wisdom, clothed himself in a new form, Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes, in Greek tradition, was a messenger of the gods and a patron of language, commerce, and exchange. But when the Greeks encountered Thoth, they recognized something deeper. Thoth was not merely a bearer of words. He was the scribe of eternity, the one who wrote the message itself and preserved it for all generations. He measured time, recorded laws, invented writing, everything that allowed knowledge to endure. From this meeting, a new figure was born, Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes, the thrice great. Thrice because he was believed to be supreme in three realms: philosophy, magic, and religion. In truth, this was simply the Greek way of expressing the boundless breadth of Thoth, translated into the framework of Western thought. Thus emerged a body of writings known as the Corpus Hermeticum, the Books of Hermes. No longer did they recount battles of gods or creation myths told through gestures of divine breath. Instead, they unfolded as dialogues of philosophy on the soul, on the cosmos, on immortality, on the bond between humanity and the divine. Picture for a moment an Egyptian priest hunched over papyrus, resin smoke curling in a shadowed chamber. Then centuries later, those same words appear translated into Greek, laid on the table of a philosopher in Alexandria. The incense had long faded. The ritual was gone, but the thought endured, reborn in a different form. That was Thoth, now speaking in the cloak of Hermes. Some call it a loss, for the gods no longer lived within ritual. Yet others call it a rebirth, for the gods crossed Egypt's borders and became the voice of the entire Mediterranean. These ideas would echo into the Roman era and later into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, when alchemists and theologians alike quoted Hermes Trismegistus as the source of ancient wisdom. Thoth was no longer seen as the ibis-headed figure wandering the banks of the Nile. Instead, he was invoked in philosophical debates, read in Greek manuscripts whispered by alchemists seeking the hidden laws of the cosmos. From papyrus to parchment, from temple to library, knowledge continued its journey wearing new skins. In this transformation, there lingers a strange aftertaste. Egyptians once lit incense for Thoth with ritual prayers. Greeks and Romans lit incense for Hermes Trismegistus with written words with questions of philosophy. Two modes of devotion, yet both driven by the same hunger, the desire to preserve eternal wisdom. And this marked a turning point. For the first time, an Egyptian god became part of the philosophical heritage of the West. No longer a deity standing in temples, but a teacher in libraries. No longer the keeper of Osiris's records, but a voice whispering into philosophers' ears about the nature of the soul. Yet this rebirth carried an unspoken tragedy. When a god exists mostly in writing and theory, he begins to lose power in daily life. No one offered morning prayers to Thoth anymore. People read Hermes in the library and discussed the universe, but they no longer felt the god standing beside them. Such is the paradox of memory. The wider it spreads, the thinner it becomes. Thoth traveled farther than ever before, but also drifted farther than ever from the Nile's waters and desert sands where once he had lived in the imagination of Egyptians. And so another question quietly arose, not only about whether wisdom can live or die, but whether the gods still exist when people keep them only in memory and no longer believe. They stand before their eyes. For thousands of years, the Egyptian gods lived in prayers, in rituals, in walls carved with sacred signs. People believed they truly ruled Osiris over death Isis with her magic, Ra with the dawn Ma'at, with the order of the cosmos. Yet, as time swept forward, as Greece and Rome stepped onto Egyptian soil, a truth became clear. The power of the gods lay not within themselves, but within the faith people placed in them. Picture an abandoned temple. The statue of a god still stands, its face serene or stern. But with no burning incense and no stories told, it becomes only stone. What then is a god without the eyes of believers to find meaning in that stone? In the Library of Alexandria, when Egyptian texts were translated into Greek, the gods left their temples and entered books. They still lived, but not among villages, harvests, or desert storms. They became concepts, philosophies, and ideas. And so a question rose. Was this a form of immortality or another kind of death? For gods do not need food nor sleep. What they need is belief. When millions lived by Ma'at Ma'at existed, when farmers along the Nile prayed to Isis, she was present. But when faith grew silent, the gods withdrew into shadow. This is not only true of Egypt, it is true of every faith humanity has ever carried. Gods' myth symbols, they are imagined communities built together by people. When that community dissolves, the god loses power. Not because they die, but because no one is left to hear them. And yet, even without vast devotion, memory lingers. The Greeks called Isis by another name, but still lit incense for her. The Romans carried Serapis into their cities. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, Hermes Trismegistus was revered by alchemists. Each time a god's name was spoken, they changed form, but each time they remained a fragment of memory echoing from ancient Egypt. Perhaps that is why the gods never truly disappear. They live on in memory, in books, in symbols. No longer figures of temples, but figures of the mind. This stirs a question. Do the gods truly need humans to exist? Or do humans need the gods as mirrors for their fears and hopes? Without storytellers, Osiris is only a name carved in stone. But without Osiris, who would remind us that death might open into another life? In the silence of ruined temples, wind still moves through broken statues. Perhaps the gods never left at all. They only change the way they are present, not standing in rituals, but sitting within questions. What are we, if not beings who cling to myths to understand ourselves? From the weighing of hearts, the feather of Maat, the spells and curses, everything leads to one point. The gods are mirrors through which humanity recognizes itself. And when the mirror cracks, we do not lose them. We only face ourselves more bare, more alone. This is the final question, yet it has no final answer. Who are the gods when no one believes in them? Perhaps they lie quietly beneath the sand. Perhaps they live on in Greek and Roman names, in philosophy and hidden rites. Or perhaps they dwell only in our longing today. And so Egyptian myth does not truly end. It only shifts from sunlit temples to the dim rooms where we now listen. From incense smoke to the sound of a voice in the ear. From communal life to the private question of each soul. But before we close, one dream remains to be told. A dream in the heart of the sand, where all things seem vanished, yet linger still like a whisper. The desert remains. Winds still sweep across broken stones, across statues with half a face, their eyes forever fixed on the horizon. Though thousands of years have passed, it seems Egypt has never been truly silent. For in every grain of sand, there are still whispers. Imagine a night in Egypt. Above, millions of stars are scattered like dust of silver. Below, the pyramids rose their shadows stretched long across the sand. Long ago, a farmer might have sat by the Nile listening to a priest speak of Atum, the first lonely god. Centuries later, a child might have listened to the tale of Osiris betrayed, and Isis wandering in search of her husband's body. And then, in Alexandria, a Greek scholar might have bent over a manuscript of Hermes Trismegistus. Each generation, each civilization added its own voice to the chorus, but sand keeps secrets better than men. Stories are told, then forgotten. Songs rise, then fade into silence. Slowly, everything becomes memory. No one is certain what the truth was or what the dream was. Yet one thing is certain, the gods never vanished entirely. They changed names, changed forms, but remained alive in human memory. Ra still rises each morning, though today we call it simply the sun. Isis is still a symbol of magic and motherhood, though painted now on Renaissance canvases. Thoth still lingers in debates about wisdom, though under the name of Hermes. Perhaps Egyptian mythology is best understood as a collective dream. A dream shared across generations, and when they awoke, its echo still lingered like a face glimpsed in sleep, forgotten in detail by morning. yet leaving behind an aftertaste that haunts the day. The strange thing is that the dream continues even without the ancient Egyptians left to tell it. It continues in our imagination today. For each time we retell it, each time we listen, the cycle begins again. The gods live on, not in temples, but in the minds of those who hear their names. Remember, Egypt never believed in an end of days. For them, there was no final silence, only circles. A god dies only to rise again. The sun sets only to return. Memory sinks only to be reborn. And so too, with their stories not closed, but drawn back to the beginning, waiting to be told once more. Perhaps this is why the myths endure. They do not require absolute belief. They only need someone to listen, someone willing to dream the unfinished dream. So, when we close this journey, let us not see it as an ending. Let us take it as a pause, and as the silence Thoth left in his unfinished texts. A silence meant for us to fill with our own thoughts. The desert still whispers. The statues still gaze into the horizon. And the dream still rests in the heart of the sand, waiting for someone to step forward, bend down, and listen. For the gods do not need us to prove they exist. They only need us to remember. And so here we leave tonight's voyage, an odyssey that began in darkness, in the first drop of water, in the loneliness of a god opening his eyes upon the universe. Thank you for staying until the end, listening to the slow rhythm of this story. Until we meet again on another evening, to continue the path of the gods, may you rest in a sleep deep and gentle, as soft as the breath of the desert beneath the moon.